Grüß Sie, willkommen in einem anderen video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 7 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series of videos. In this video I'll be covering the preservers, which save doomed races and seeded them in safer locations, allowing humanoid life to spread to even more planets. In the Paradise Syndrome, Spock says, "Yes, the obelisk is a marker, just as I thought. It was left by a super race known as the Preservers. They passed through the galaxy, recruiting or rescuing primitive cultures which were in danger of extinction and seeding them, so to speak, where they could live and grow. Who are these preservers? How many worlds have they affected? When were they saving civilizations, and why were they saving civilizations?" Let's drill down in more detail to see what the preservers did in the specific case described in the episode The Paradise Syndrome, which is primary data or information. McCoy states, "That's probably how the planet has survived all these centuries. The preservers put an asteroid deflector on the planet. We know the preservers placed a deflector on the planet to protect it from asteroids. Without it, the inhabitants of the planet would have never survived. Thus, we know the preservers will leave devices to protect other races in danger." There is another mystery on this planet. The plant life is identical to Earth. Spock indicates it would be highly improbable that it would evolve similar to Earth in this way. We can infer the preservers must have done this when they set up the deflector. Before the deflector, this was probably a battered and much more primitive world, which did not resemble current Earth in any way. Then yet another mystery arises. The inhabitants not only look like American Indian, but Spock says they are American Indians. It's as if the American Indians and other elements of their ecosystem on Earth were taken from Earth and placed on this planet. Why would this be the case? One possible theory is the preservers saw the American Indians on Earth during the Ice Age, determined they were under threat. They then picked up the people under threat and reproduced their world on another planet. They needed to pick a planet with minimal prior life, so they selected an asteroid-battered planet. By stopping the asteroids and terraforming the planet, they created a paradise for the people they saved. The Ice Age ended about 10,000 years ago on Earth, so they may have taken the Indians at the Ice Age peak, sometime between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. This is what Spock said earlier, which is based on the interpretation of the musical language of the preservers. An interesting point: if they were plopped in this planet 10,000 years ago, why haven't they developed? One possible other theory is that while the planet was being terraformed, they may have been put into some form of suspended animation, so they've not actually been living on the planet for a full 10,000 years. This is alluded in a conversation between McCoy and Spock. McCoy states, "I've always wondered why there are so many humanoids scattered throughout the galaxy." Spock replied, "So have I. Apparently the preservers account for a number of them." It should be noted Spock only said a number of them, not all the humanoids scattered around the galaxy. As we've already discussed, the Seeders also had a hand in doing something similar, but for different reasons and for a lot longer ago. Something similar to this occurred in another episode, in this case the episode called The Empath. Kirk did not enjoy himself so much in this episode, but here we have a race which is going to save a civilization which is threatened with destruction because of a supernova. In this episode we see the aliens and discover their name, which is Vians. While I admit in this case the aliens seem to act in a psychotic manner, they are testing a number of several races to determine which to save, so they could only save one. Thus, presumably they would have saved everyone if they could. Or could they? Or would they? Their behaviour was rather unusual, I have to admit. Most interestingly, in the script, it's actually written, two big-headed aliens in silver robes appear, first cousins to the TOS people by the looks of it. I'm uncertain who wrote that, but they do look similar to the Talosians. I'll be coming back to that point later. There's another possible example, in this case in the episode The Apple. Here we have a primitive people and a mechanism which controls the weather, which I would assume provides them with food, in exchange for some of that food being deposited in the creature or the device as a sacrifice. Perhaps this planet has very unstable weather patterns which need to be controlled, and as in the Paradise Syndrome, someone from the people themselves have to do something to keep the ball rolling. Perhaps if no one does anything, the device assumes there are no people there, so there's not much point in doing anything, and it may be going to some sort of self-destruct mechanism. The only negative evidence is the inhabitants are kept in some sort of stasis, but then we know the Vians are a bit psychotic and may not care how they ensure the people they save are kept safe, as long as they're kept safe for some reason. This does raise a dark possibility. Perhaps the preservers are preserving races for some other reason. Perhaps they need a pool of races to randomly select individuals for some reason. I have no proof of this, but why are the preservers doing what they're doing and the way they're doing it? I've found a possible third example, which are the aliens which assisted Gary 7 to stop World War III. Gary 7 lived among these aliens and gained a host of powers to them, both physical and in terms of knowledge. It's also implied in the episode that agents of this alien race stopped the civilization or the civilization of Omicron 4 from destroying itself in a similar way. The aliens and their planet, which is identified as only having or being one planet, is hidden. We know it's 1,000 light years away from Earth, or at least that is the location Gary teleported from, which I have to assume is the planet. I have no other solid examples to prove the preservers are doing their business, but this is a really wild guess, but the inhabitants of the planet in a private little war may well have been placed there by the preservers. But look, I have to admit there is no evidence of this, and it's really only based on my own gut feeling. While I can find no other solid evidence that the preservers are doing their business, it's also possible that any very human-like race, which is also primitive, may be a candidate for a civilization that's been redeployed to a new planet. In these examples, we can say the preservers have been around for about, let's say, 100,000 years at the most, and are still engaged in saving races up to the period in the Star Trek 5-year mission. Now let's try and work out where the Vians may come from and why they're doing what they are doing. The Vians do look like the Telosians, and while it was the comment in the script that got me down this track, I feel this is probably a very good theory. Notice I did not say it's correct, as when the writers of Star Trek were doing their writing, no one was attempting to create a robust and coherent universe or world. All we can do is present our theories and see if the theory fits all available facts. The analysis is all about theories based on the tidbits of information the writers left, often randomly and without any thought. We do know the Telosians experienced a war thousands of centuries ago, which we can assume to be 200,000 years. Before that, they lived on the surface. Afterwards, they lived underground. If the Telosians had a war, who were they fighting? I expect the Telosians were divided into two alliances and they fought each other. One retreated underground and the other into space. Both factions would have been incredibly weak and few in number, which made continuing the war pointless. They are only interested in survival at this point. It's possible the Telosians who fled into space are the Vians. They rebuilt their civilization and then started saving other races, possibly starting this 100,000 years ago and continuing until the time covered in the 5-year mission of Kirk. Now let's deal with why they are saving other races. We know the Telosians had a virtual zoo in their underground lair on their home planet. While the two creatures shown do not look like an intelligent species, it's difficult to tell. After all, how did they end up in the zoo? The Telosians could have lured other spacecraft to their planet. So, if that's correct, these must be intelligence. It's also possible these are the animals which the Telosians already had when they went underground and kept in the zoos for 200,000 years. Probably a bit unlikely, that last theory, but you never know. It could be the case. Both creatures shown do not wear any clothing and look more like animals. But putting that to one side, the idea of using other races to do your work is not something which is unusual to this race. Could the Vians think the same way? We know the Vians don't save every race they come across. In the Empath, they were very selective. Perhaps they only saved races which are of value to them in some way. If correct, the Vian interest in Earth is a worry. It may not be entirely benevolent. I have a theory that when the Enterprise went back to Earth and intercepted Gary 7, they broke their own timeline and created the TNG timeline. which did not contain a World War III occurring so early. Perhaps if the Enterprise was not there, Gary would have died somehow. After all, the original 2 agents sent by the mysterious aliens died in a very unusual car accident. Perhaps something is working against Gary 7's aliens, and the Enterprise interfered with this. I'll leave my thought processes at that point for people to think about and end this particular video, which is the end of my part 7 of my Star Trek TOS timeline, in this case covering the mysterious preservers. The episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.